Hey now, Brawlers, it's time for another Board Game Brawl review with Nick Minahan, sponsored by BoardGameBliss.com.
Hey folks, we're going to take a look at the newest expansion for T.I.M.E Stories from Space Cowboys, and that is called Lumen Fidei, which I believe is the 5th expansion, not counting the base game's expansion, or the base game's module for T.I.M E Stories. Now, a couple things here. First off, if you're worried about it, as I've done in the past, this is going to be split into two parts in the same video. Non-spoilers in the beginning, just so I can give you a general idea of what I think about the expansion, and then total spoilers in the other half of the video for those of you who have already played through it and just want to know what I think about the minutiae of it. If you're not familiar with T.I.M E Stories at all, I do have a review for that, or there are countless other reviews in the YouTube universe or multiverse, so go and check out any of those. Doesn't matter, but please check out mine, I guess. But if you just want to know just generally what T.I.M E Stories is, and if you have no experience with it whatsoever, which means it's really weird that you're watching this, it is a modular-based game. You have a base game that has one adventure with it and some very generic components. Then the rest of the expansions for it plug in using those base components, and you are time agents who are in the far, far future who get sent back to different time periods and also sometimes into alternate dimensional time periods in order to fix problems like rifts and discrepancies. Think Legends of Tomorrow, but better production values. So that's kind of what's going on here. And each one has a different type of theme. So I'm not speaking out of school here. These aren't really spoilers because it's kind of known already. The first adventure in the base game is an asylum in the 1920s. The second adventure takes place in a small town in the 1990s. The third adventure takes place in, I think that's the Prophecy of Dragons one, which takes place in an alternate fantasy Tolkien-esque universe. And so on and so forth. Now, what this one does, the Lumen Fidei, is it takes place during the Crusades. And so this is the non-spoiler part, so I'll just be very generic about it. You and the other players need to go back to the period of the Crusades where the Christians are fighting against the Moors, and lots of... to their credit, there's actually lots of details about history and things like that. If you're so inclined, you can read quite a bit of it as you go through the adventure. Saying too much more than that would be a little bit spoilery, but I will say a few things here. First off, for those of you who have experience with Prophecy of Dragons, this is much more in line with that as opposed to a few of the other expansions, in the sense that it has more of an epic scope and feel to it. Maybe not quite as much, or maybe on the same level as Prophecy of Dragons. I'd have to replay that one, which probably won't happen, to figure it out for sure, just as far as time goes. Although I know we spent way more time trying to complete Prophecy of Dragons. Lumen Fidei was, I'll just say Lumen from now on, it seemed much easier to me, except there was a very tricky puzzle that I think a lot of people got tripped up on. That wasn't really like a problem with the game, just a problem with, not being able to figure it out right away. But other than that, it was a pretty straightforward adventure. But I really like the theming and the flavor of it. Being based in the Crusades, sort of an Assassin's Creed type feeling came back to me. And so I really enjoyed that aspect of it. I was wondering if there's a lot of people who are in the hardcore board gaming community who are very religious, and I was very curious about... I am the absolute opposite of that. I was very curious what they would think about this module, if they think it was, offensive or not, or things like that. But I think that the writers of the game handled the subject matter pretty ably, so I wasn't too worried about that. I think the difficulty of this one was, while that was on the lighter side, the storytelling aspects were actually some of the deeper writing they've had in the game, to its credit. There weren't a ton of puzzles, but like I said, the one that tripped me up was pretty interesting. And it's kind of tough, again, because of spoilers, but I will say that there weren't a lot of absolute brand new mechanisms, at least not that that were part of the base game. Like, the characters worked basically the same. What you were doing in the game was mostly the same, but they did throw a few curveballs in there, and that's what I appreciate the most. And it's why I compare this one to Prophecy of Dragons, because it's taking the tried and true T.I.M E Stories mechanics, but sort of flipping them in some interesting ways at certain junctures and really making the most of the system, and that it's very open-ended and open source in that regard. So the theming is interesting. The challenge was just about right because it wasn't too frustrating and lets you experience the story. This is not a strategic gamer's game. It never was. This is more for just people that want that big, deep thematic experience. And I think that this module definitely delivers that. It is certainly better than the last two adventures. The last two adventures were Under the Mask and Expedition 19 something, which was not very good. Well, that one was actually okay. Under the Mask was pretty awful. It is, in my opinion, the worst of the Time Stories expansions, and it really was making me think like, wow, Prophecy of Dragons might have been a total one-off, because even the last one, Expedition, was not that great. It was just okay. This one, though, gives me hope that it actually solidifies the hope that there is a lot more good stuff coming through Time Stories. And especially, what can I say here? The ending of this adventure delves more into the overall arcing mythos of the game, which I really appreciate, because if it was just like, all right, time agents, go back to your time period and have an adventure, and then come back and we'll do it all over again, that would not hold my attention nearly as much as if there wasn't actually something going on in the present day, the future time space that your agents are coming from. So there is that as well. I like the artwork in this one. I've actually liked the artwork to varying degrees in all of the expansions, but some are better than others. Probably not coincidentally, I thought Under the Mask had the worst artwork of the lot, but this one falls on the good side of it. Definitely comic book inspired graphic novel art. So that's pretty much it. I think this is a good one. I think that if you're into Time Stories, definitely pick it up. If you're wondering which expansions to pick up, it's kind of a tough thing because they are supposed to be played in order to some degree. But I also think that if you just are not going to commit to doing that right off the bat, buy the base game, get Prophecy of Dragons, and then this would be the next one. Or you can flip the order too, depending on which theme interests you most. Tolkien fantasy or historic medieval crusades, but sort of not. So that is the non-spoiler part of my Lumen Fidei review. Now let's get into spoilers. Alright, so everything I said in my non-spoiler part stands. If you've already played this, you know what to expect. I thought this was a very good adventure, and I also thought that it introduced some very interesting concepts to the game, while still feeling pretty samey, which is fine. Now, as far as the story goes, there's pluses and minuses here. Let me tell you the negative stuff right off the bat. Because it's overwhelmed by the good stuff, which is good. So I'm not too worried about it, but I feel it is worth it to point out the things that I think are negative. First off, every adventure is starting to feel like it's going to have the exact same arc. Now, it's good or bad depending on what perspective you're getting from it. I actually thought it was very interesting how the Marcy case didn't have the same type of ending that these other ones have, where it ended kind of abruptly, and that can be seen as a fault, but I thought it ended in a way that was thematic to what they were trying to do. But every other adventure seems to go through these sort of trials and tribulations and puzzles and things like that, and then eventually big bad with swarms of supernatural creatures around it, and then you have to fight. And I was disappointed to see it was the exact same thing again this time. At least Prophecy of Dragons had that weird time shift thing with things from different time periods, because you weren't actually fighting someone native to that time period in that adventure. Hopefully you've played Prophecy of Dragons. I probably should have said this is a spoiler for everything. Whatever. I'll keep that to a minimum. So I was disappointed that this one was like, oh, there's evil sorcerer guy, Kahlua, and he wants to just, it's all very nebulous, but he's got armies of the undead ghouls, and there's some sort of bizarre ritual revolving the stone that you want, the MacGuffin. I was disappointed that it all culminated into that. On the other hand, what am I expecting from a board game expansion? I do have to couch it in those terms. As if you compare this to other board games, the storytelling is off the charts. No other game is doing this type of stuff at all. If you compare this to a good or just decent TV show or movie, it falls flat and is very cliche and trite. But For this, I think it works well. Everything leading up to that was far more interesting. The dynamic of the piety and the faith, and this is where it's tough doing a non-spoiler and spoiler, because I would have liked to have mentioned this stuff, but I didn't know if it was too much of a spoiler to even mention that there was a piety track in my non-spoiler part of this, but I thought that was very interesting, but didn't come into play enough. That's the other negative I have about this. That it was just like, oh, if you're on this side, you know, this might... There were very few instances of like, you're going to get this extra super special bonus thing for being either very pious or being a heretic. Instead, it was just bonuses to your dice rolls, which was nice, but because the parties we played with were both mixed, it didn't really seem to matter. It all came out in the wash. It only seemed to matter with the two NPCs that you could get, which were either the evil agent taking the body of a djinn, which is kind of weird, because this game plays fast and loose with magical things being actual things, and just future time-space tech, and them mixing together, which is kind of odd, but it's fun too. But that was the only thing that seemed to matter with the piety, so you either have this holy priest guy with you, or this sort of demon chick. And so it almost didn't matter, because when you grab one or the other, your piety or heretical bottoms out or tops off. I just thought that could have been handled a little bit better, but again, the fact that it was even there was very cool, and I appreciated it. So the stuff that I just out and out liked. I like the theming. Crusades, it's a cool time period. I wouldn't have minded if they were more sacrilegious and they even were in the module, but they handled it in a very over-the-top comic book way, like I said, like an Assassin's Creed type thing. So I thought that was pretty cool. And for what they had to work with, they put a lot of little bits of history and flavor in there that I really appreciated. They did the best they could with a very brief 1 hour long module. Unless you do multiple run-throughs. We actually managed to do this in 3. Take that for what it's worth. I thought the whole final act was actually much easier than a lot of other Time Stories adventures. Not that there were a lot of other ones. I think the big thing to talk about here, and let's not beat around the bush too much, and if you've played this, you know what I'm talking about, hopefully, or you shouldn't be watching this part of it, is everything that happened at the end with the decisions you have to make. And I'll be just totally honest with you, when I was with my group, we made a decision, and we stuck to it, which was just to go straight up good guy. Which is to say, we told the demon chick to piss off, and what's her name? Yasmina. Piss off, Yasmin Bleef, and we went with the Pope, the legate of the Pope, who ended up being an angel person, which is kind of corny. But we went with that. And so because of that, obviously, there was no circumstance for me to make another type of drastic decision at the end. Although, in either scenario, no matter who you take, you could potentially cooperate with Kahlua, and that with my group that this wasn't going to fly. So, and I know that this is like against the spirit of Time Stories, but I think I've told you I've done this kind of thing in the past. I did a solo playthrough for myself and made the other types of decisions, which were infinitely more interesting, but more nebulous morally, of course. It's becoming more and more clear that the Time Agency is either completely fucking inept, or evil, bad people, or both. Kind of like the Trump administration. Can't really figure out. It's one of those two things or both, but, can't be none of them. So, I actually think that this is very interesting storytelling, because but this is why the game is kind of cursed. It's a board game that you're supposed to just be able to buy whatever expansions you want, but it helps if you play them in order, because you would know it's been building up to this type of thing. And it's only going to get more pronounced as time goes on. Sort of this culmination of events piling on top of one another. But the whole thing with the QR codes was very interesting. Although I always look, I don't mind apps and board games, but this wasn't really an app. I always hate it when they make you go and get different things from different sources and push them all back together, like augmented reality games, or when a movie tells you to check out the website. I'm like, no, just tell me. So that was a little annoying, although the information that you got from following that, and maybe you didn't make those decisions, so I'm not going to go into too much detail about that, even in the spoiler section. But I I thought that there was at least very good storytelling and a very cool thing. And again, I don't expect to see any of this in board games, so that's a cool thing too. And ultimately, on the run that I did, I decided to, for just my final one and done ending of the game, to cooperate with Demon Tiefling Girl, but still have a successful mission, and not cooperate with Kahlua, and then it's sort of a nebulous success. But that's fine. I don't think stories should have completely clean, neat, happy endings. The other most important thing to talk about with this is the weird puzzle with the astrologer, which, according to what I saw on the Board Game Geek forums, a lot of people were having issues with, because figuring out the puzzle is one thing, but then like figuring out that you have to look in the box, again, making me go out of the game to go get something. It's clever, it's fun, it's funny, but meh. But that's fine. And so things like that. Again, I like the chase. When the Black Guard is chasing you, that's a cool little bit. That's taking the standard elements of Time Stories, but shifting them enough that it doesn't break the game too badly that you have to learn a whole new game, but it makes it fun. It adds a little bit of tension to the game where there was none before. There's little bits like rescuing the witches, and that you actually have two different ways to get in past that scenario of the game, splitting it up into different chapters. And also the way that they ease you into this adventure by giving you the 10 time units, and then 20, and then eventually 30. I think that's actually much more manageable. I think they did that in the last one a little bit too. So I like this adventure a lot. This is definitely more in line with what I want to see from Time Stories, like Prophecy of Dragons, which is still my favorite just because I like the theming better. But this is also a good theme too, and I like it quite a bit. I want to see more of this going into the lore of the Time Agency itself and their opponent, their enemies, the Scions and whatever, the Cyans. But I also hope that it's a little bit cleaner and neater. And right now it seems like they're experimenting from adventure to adventure, which I guess is the only way you can actually do that with this type of thing. It's not like they were going to plan out 20 expansions all at once before they released the first version of the game. But hopefully they settle on at least a basic framework, and then just go nuts within that, like their own personal playground. But at least settle on, okay, this is what the game is going to throw at you as far as like the stuff outside of the game. I don't know, this sounds weird, but still, I'd rather have surprises than none, because right now, most of the games that I play are just cookie cutters of other games, and just feel samey and boring and nothing special. Time Stories is special, and keeps delivering on the promise of being different. So that is the newest expansion, Lumen Fidei. Check it out.